Indonesia has announced it's cutting Australian beef imports by 80%. It's distressing news for Australian cattle farmers, and Labor is suggesting Indonesia's move may be related to recent diplomatic tensions between the two countries. The government says, though, that it's a trade issue, not a diplomatic one. That's not the view of the federal member for Kennedy, Independent Bob Katter. His electorate is one of Australia's biggest beef-producing regions, and he joined me a short time ago from Brisbane. Mr Katter, thank you very much for your time this evening. What do you think will be the impact of this decision by Indonesia in your electorate?
I hate to say this because it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but absolutely disastrous. We expected this year to be sending about 500, 600,000 head of cattle to Indonesia. This 50,000 means we'll at most over the next 12 months send 200,000 unless something breaks. Well, I mean, I can hardly see a Prime Minister who's gone out of his way to kick Indonesia at every single available opportunity, having a good enough relationship to reopen the cattle market.
Is this...
Now, before, I did an immense amount of work personally with the ambassador. The ambassador is a true Christian, even though he's a Muslim, but he's a very, very Christian man, and he's tried desperately to make happiness between our two countries. Well, I don't know, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister, all I can say is their performance has been disgraceful, and it has been no better and probably worse than Julia Gillard's, if that's humanly possible.
What evidence do you have that Indonesia is doing this in retaliation for any sort of perceived diplomatic slight?
The minute that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister went on the attack of a neighbouring government and criticised their laws and said that an Australian should not be subject to their laws, and defended two drug traffickers, people responsible for over 1,000 deaths a year in Australia, and insulted the people of that country, and to quote the retired head of ASIO for Australia, provoking, confronting and speaking in a most arrogant manner. That's how he described our behaviour towards Indonesia, or at least that is how the Indonesians see our behaviour. Remember, they're colonial power ruled by Europeans. So we start with a sensitivity here. A sensitivity from our side has been turkey trampled.
Isn't it the case, though, that exports in all sorts of areas, beef included, fluctuate quite a lot, and so that, this could be just part of the normal cyclical up and down fluctuations?
No, absolute rubbish. As I said, the minute they launched on yet another attack upon the Indonesian people, and I think it was an attack upon the Indonesian people, when they launched upon another attack upon the Indonesian people, I immediately prepared a question in the Parliament. And I finished that question by saying, the first Australians, Madam Minister, the first Australians realised that friction causes fire. And it was my people, the cattlemen of Australia, that got burnt last time. Who's going to get burnt this time, Minister? Who's going to get burnt this time? Well, it's going to be the cattlemen again.
But Indonesia accounts for fewer than 10% of Australian beef exports, so how is anything that Indonesia does destroying the entire industry?
When I was a very young man, the famous Ron Cam, father of the sugar industry in recent years, Ron said if you've got 5% overproduction, the price is going to fall straight through the floor. If you've got 5% underproduction, the price will go through the roof. Well, we started this year with 5% underproduction, and the price went through the roof for the first time in about 8 years. And of course, it has now been destroyed by the irresponsible actions of the federal government.
But the price is still pretty strong.
And it's not only this issue, it's again and again and again. They seem to be wanting to pick a fight and have an antagonism with Indonesia. Well, maybe they would have a different viewpoint if, when they were 18, handed a rifle and had to give 2 telephone numbers because we're at war with Indonesia. And that was my situation. Maybe they'd have a different attitude if they came from North Queensland, where in the last war we were handed over to the Japanese under the Brisbane line. Maybe they'd have a different attitude. But the attitude of irresponsibility here is beyond belief.
Speaking of being handed a rifle, just before we go, this program featured a story tonight about the importation of an 8-shot gun into Australia under the most accessible firearms category. Your son-in-law is the importer. I don't say that because in any way you're responsible for what your son-in-law does. I just say it in the interest of transparency. Is a weapon of that type really needed in Australia?
Look, you know, I'm pro-gun, and maybe that comes from the fact that, I was handed a rifle to protect my country as a lad of 17 and a half or 18, whatever I was at the time. Whatever it is, and also
Mr.
coming from a bush background. I'm very pro-gun. I've been all of my life, long before I met my son-in-law.
Well, you're probably a very
I've always been very
responsible...
pro-gun, and that's the way I'll be staying.
You're probably a very responsible gun owner, though, and a very responsible gun user, but not everyone is probably the same as you. So are these sort of weapons the things that we really do want in Australia under the most accessible firearms category?
I welcome the intellectual debate. I welcome it and love the intellectual debate, because never have I been on stronger ground.
But why do we need...
And I don't know anything about what you're talking about. I only was informed of about an hour ago.
OK. Well, Mr Katter, thank you.
So I don't know anything about it.
Thank you very much for your time this evening. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.